So, why are there so many camera related issues during boss fights in the Elden Ring DLC? Undoubtedly, you know what I'm referring to. The funny part being that the nature of most of them are so different as well. It's not all during a giant boss. For instance, the Dancing Lion. While the design of the boss is really cool, a lot of the movement it does results in the camera having a hard time keeping proper track of it without having very janky adjustments. This is doubly problematic when you receive a hit from the boss, especially ones that knock you on your ass, and the boss ends up going past you, snapping the camera in that direction. Of course, this is a worse spot to be in, as you are now at least lower on health and are put in a vulnerable position, where the camera potentially disorients you. Because this boss is fairly unique among the series, it's hard to say that this is an issue that's happened before. The closest I can say is a boss like the Cleric Beast, where the design of the head region goes a little bit over your character's head, and occasionally can cause the camera to freak out if locked onto the head and it's doing certain attacks. Or if you're up against the wall or something, but it's not unusual for walls to mess with the camera. Sometimes that's more of an arena issue than it is a camera or boss design one. So, how could you fix an encounter like this? I think a few tweakings to the moveset that already exists would be good enough in most cases. For example, the one where they stand, for the lack of a better word, could either not go up as high, or the camera could adjust itself for the move a tiny bit. I can't recall a specific example where the camera shifts for a single attack. I know Monster Hunter does it from time to time. But in Dark Souls 3, Yudhix's Gundyr would have a camera shift as the face transitions, so they've done something akin to this before. As for the normal charges, I think having the charge not go as far, or aim more specifically at you, could do it. The problem is mostly how far it goes even after it already hit you. Perhaps it could not do it unless it's a very specific distance to avoid this issue too. But admittedly, FromSoft doesn't seem that keen to even limit attacks that are often borderline unfair when they're done right in front of you. The wind twirly mid-air attack would be tricky. The camera angle pulling back to show more area could work, but it's hard to say for sure. It's an interesting attack, so it doesn't need to be cut entirely, but it is flawed. There could be other attacks that also mess with the camera that I'm forgetting, but just tweaking a few of these would be a massive improvement. Of course, one pseudo solution is that you could play without lock-on. In some cases, this is the optimal way to play, but it certainly shouldn't be a requirement for a boss that doesn't have any aspects out of the ordinary, such as a dual boss or one where you need to focus the legs to attack or something. Since we already alluded to and showed him, let's go to the next example, Bayle. His issues are basically an exacerbated version of when Dancing Lion charges you and ends up passing you while you're already down, messing with the camera angle. Except for Bayle, because of his design and size, ends up getting over you a lot more than the prior example, and not always due to the charge. Sizes of bosses have been a problem when it comes to the camera issues in the series prior, such as Ancient Dragon in Dark Souls 2. Where being such a big boss makes it difficult to know what it's doing when you're first learning it. But that's only a fraction of the problem in this case, with Bayle. The other is how agile it is, despite its size. Unrealism that comes with such a giant entity being able to accelerate as fast as it does aside, it presents the aforementioned mechanical issues as well, much more than just a normal big boss would. As a perfect counterexample, we can have a look at Midir from Dark Souls 3. This boss is also a giant dragon that's hanging lower to the ground, and the head is the obvious spot the game intends you to punish the most. However, Midir's head is a lot further from the space where you can be underneath the boss, meaning that as long as you're spaced well, it'll be rare that you end up in an awkward spot like with Bayle. Furthermore, although Midir does also have a charge attack, it surprisingly only does it when you're further away from it, so I don't recall ever being in a place like Bayle's charge where I end up underneath it, struggling with a camera. He also generally doesn't move around nearly as much, so you're able to punish Midir more consistently than Bayle, I find. But perhaps that's a little outside the point. So a lot of the ways to fix this boss are just following what Midir had already done before. Though when it comes to getting next to or underneath Bayle, well, the design doesn't exactly allow for that. So it's a problem that would need more severe changes if it demanded change. But overall, on a personal level, I would easily love the presentation and everything about Bayle more than I do Midir, but some of these issues kinda hold it back for me a bit, though I do still think it's an awesome fight. And now for the last major example you've probably been thinking about since the beginning of the video, Radahn 2.0. Amazingly, this also somehow manages to bring a new way to making the camera unbearable. Most of the discussion is focused on phase 2, but even starting in phase 1, there's at least one move that can cover your camera at inopportune times. The Blood Explosion attack can often block Radahn doing an instant follow-up attack, which, well, I hope I don't have to elaborate why that's not a great choice. But actually going into phase 2, the obvious thing to point out is the Light Beam show. Now, even just mechanically, this attack is definitely a lot to deal with. Even once you understand where you need to be and where to roll to avoid them, odds are you'll still be checked by light beams every once in a while. But even that aside, the amount of things covering the screen in a good chunk of this fight is absolutely insane. And that's not to mention Miquella's freaking hair. If you're right behind Radahn at any point, Miquella's hair makes it much more difficult to be able to read what Radahn is about to use, if he doesn't decide to step away to face you. Just in general, this is a very overstimulating fight. The closest example I can come to this one from previous games is Emilia from Bloodborne. It's one of the only other bosses that has an aspect of its design being so much that it makes it genuinely hard to see, especially when you're behind her with all her fur. She also will try to backstep to get you in front of her, so it's not a problem for long, but it certainly made a spotlight on Bloodborne, as that's the first time it had really been an issue to this degree in FromSoft's games. As for the solutions, for the blood attack, I'd say either don't allow him to follow up instantly with another attack, or only do the attacks that have a lengthy enough windup. Miquella should get a haircut, and the light show, well, that's a little more complicated, because reducing the amount of beams that show up in any point, or cutting them out entirely, I would imagine would fundamentally change the boss design much more than the previous examples. So the answer I can't say is as cut and dry without doing so, especially given how much of the boss fight features them. I guess let me know how you would change it yourself. A few other bosses I want to know from the DLC are Meteor and Romina. Meteor was actually surprised that this wasn't as much of an issue for. Most of the body will be in view for the fight, despite how big the boss is, and the one attack or two that uses its thumb head will sort of pull back the boss, so it's still visible enough to know what's going on. So I was pleasantly surprised. Romina is a good boss overall in my opinion. The only reason I want to point it out is because the one thing that cuts the line very close is just how very slightly the centipede head and the tail are out of frame during lock-on. Thankfully you can still see those two limbs move whenever they're about to attack, so it still works out fine. But I wouldn't have been upset if the lock-on spot was a tiny bit higher, or the camera is pulled back just a tad more during the boss fight. As for the rest of the main bosses in Shadow of the Erdtree, a lot of them aren't big enough or awkwardly shaped enough to be an issue, thankfully. But I do think not only are the earlier main three a big enough portion of the bosses that this needs to be addressed, they're also three of the most important ones. The only other ones I would consider important are Renala and Mesmer, but those fall into the type of bosses that I'd be genuinely impressed if there was camera issues, at least the way these are. But the weird part is that this really wasn't an issue in the Elden Ring based game. I looked through the list. The bosses that could show an issue like this, so say Starscourge Radahn, Rykard, Basirusax, and the Elden Beast, the camera is not a noteworthy issue per se. Some of these you do have to tackle differently, like Basirusax and Elden Beast, and that you might not want to lock on necessarily, but their hitbox is pretty big so it's not a big issue for melee range. So it was strange how much it showed up in the DLC. Would I go as far as to say that this is a problem in the DLC overall? Perhaps not. It's a case-by-case basis, but there is grounds to say that this wasn't a major problem, say until Bloodborne, where bosses like Cleric Beast, Emilia, perhaps Ebrietas, could have some issues. But that was also in some regards a case-by-case issue, as the design for Ebrietas, for instance, has a similar issue to Cleric Beast, where the head will go over a character, so it was more so a matter of design philosophy per game. Because surprisingly, this wasn't an issue in Dark Souls 3 when I went to look at the list either, and tried out some of the bosses I thought could be. Nonetheless, this is one of the issues that I have seen the community have fairly universally, even among people who might like the DLC overall, especially when it comes to Radahn and Dancing Lion. And given it's the likely first and last boss people would encounter, I do think it's something that should be addressed. And that's all for the video. I tried something a little bit different in this one, just how I kind of structured it, because I was originally going to have the exact same format as I did with the delayed attack video, where I kind of just describe how the issue came about over time, when it wasn't really a problem early on. And I certainly could have made it like that, but the more I looked into it, as I said, it's mostly a case-by-case basis, where maybe the problem shows up more in a certain game, which I think Bloodborne is the main culprit before the DLC here. But even among those, the list isn't as big as I thought it was at first. So I don't feel the need to cover it as in-depth like that, even though I could have. I was originally going to go into a lot of examples of how the earlier games, like Demon's Souls and Dark Souls 1, would kind of tackle any boss that was kind of a little too big for their own good. And I guess for a peek behind the curtain, if you want to know about that, I found that a lot of those early games would actually have the camera pulled back during the boss arena. And I think that is something the game should do more of lately. Not that it's always necessary, but it overall helps a lot with not only just the framing of any big boss, but also helps with just the framing of, hey, this is a giant enemy compared to me. That my camera's just like, whoa, let me pull back a little bit, you know? So it's a cool effect. But hey, I mean, I could eventually make a video just detailing all the different ways that the camera angle acts, or for the bosses or something, or during lock-on. But it would be a lot of work, because I'd have to get a lot of footage, which I probably won't end up using anymore. But maybe I'll keep it just in case. But anyway, if you want to see more videos like this one, where I kind of critique the game, maybe occasionally praise it for something it does well, here's the last video I did on delayed attacks. I did make a playlist as well, because I have been discussing a lot of little things about Elden Ring, negative and positive, in the past. And if you think you like those kinds of videos, do consider subscribing. Thank you as well to my members who are supporting my channel. And yeah, I hope to see you again, everybody. Have a good one. Bye-bye.